Welcome back to the subconscious classroom. Tonight, we open a door rarely walked through, one that leads not to memory, but to its preservation. Not to history, but to those who wrote it in blood and bureaucracy. This isn't a tale of murderers in the shadows. It's about those who killed in broad daylight, legally, systematically, and then, as if it were just another day at the office, wrote it all down. The executioners, the torturers, the bureaucrats of death. These weren't the ones who killed in passion or with trembling hands. These were the ones who took notes, who documented agony, who filled journals with names, dates, and details that no human being should ever have had to imagine, let alone survive. And in the margins, sometimes pride, sometimes poetry. Let us begin. Part 1, the ink never flinched. They called him Meister France, a man of discipline, a man of precise handwriting, a man who, by his own count, executed over 300 people and kept a fastidious journal of every single one. Franz Schmidt was the official executioner of Nuremberg in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. But if you had stumbled across his diary without context, you might think it belonged to a surgeon, or a municipal clerk, or a local priest tracking parish births and deaths. His entries were calm, clean, dated, lined with care. June 18, 1589, Hans Vogel, a thief and arsonist, beheaded with the sword. A single sentence, just enough to register the death. And then the next, and the next. Sometimes he wrote more, not out of remorse, but to justify technique, or to comment on the criminal's behavior. Did they weep? Did they confess? Did they resist? France believed in justice. That's the terrifying part. He didn't delight in violence, not in the theatrical sense. He saw himself as a servant of moral order. His father had been an executioner, and despite the legal necessity of the role, executioners lived as pariahs, separate from polite society, even as they enforced its rules. France took pride in doing his duty with dignity. His final act, years after he retired, was petitioning the emperor to clear his family name of the stain of executioner's blood. And he succeeded. But his notebook endures, bound in vellum, preserved in archives, a relic of a man who believed that even death could be administered honorably, if only it were written down. He was not alone. Across medieval Europe, death registers quietly circulated between monasteries, city officials, and state torturers. These were not secret books. In many cases, they were state records, a tool of governance. If a criminal had confessed under torture, it was recorded in careful Latin script. If a witch had screamed in agony under the rack, the notary made sure the confession was legible. In Spain, during the height of the Inquisition, scribes sat just beyond the edge of candlelight, scratching away as men were flayed alive. They did not intervene. They did not cry. Their job was to record. Torture was, after all, a legal process, and every legal process needed documentation. These records had official titles: acta, protocoli, processi, but in truth, they were simply acts of transcription, human pain reduced to text, no different structurally than a tax form. Take the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous Hammer of Witches, published in 1487. Though technically a manual, not a diary, it reads like a journal of evil shared among peers. Each section teaches inquisitors not only how to spot witches, but how to break them. It is disturbingly detailed. The use of sleep deprivation, the illusion of mercy, the trick of pretending pity just before the final blow. And though it claims divine sanction, the tone is unervingly procedural. As if the devil could be defeated by clerical exactitude. And then came the 20th century, the age of mass production of punch cards, of state machinery so vast that it needed entire floors of offices just to manage the dead. In Nazi Germany, the bureaucracy of genocide was as relentless as the violence itself. There were no dripping dungeon walls, no scribes by candlelight. There were typewriters, filing cabinets, forms in triplicate. The final solution was built not just on cruelty, but on clerical efficiency. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of Jewish deportation to the camps, was not a man of battlefield rage. He was an administrator. He scheduled trains. He coordinated logistics. He followed orders. His personal notes survive, and they are horrifying in their banality. Transport B-146 departed 8:17 from Brno, 1,004 persons. Arrival at Auschwitz confirmed.
No complications. No complications.
It is perhaps the most chilling phrase in all of modern history, because what he meant was no missed connections, no broken rails,
No delays.
that the machinery of death, its timetables, its inventories, ran smoothly. In his trial decades later, Eichmann protested that he was not personally cruel, that he had never directly harmed anyone, that he was merely following the law. But he kept the notes, he kept the records, he filled out the forms. He helped write history in real time, even as it bled from the pages. In Japan, Unit 731 conducted some of the most horrific medical experiments in recorded history during World War II. They injected prisoners with plague, froze limbs to study frostbite, dissected captives alive, all in the name of scientific progress. And they wrote it all down. The doctors and officers of Unit 731 kept research logs like any modern laboratory. Charts, diagrams, patient notes, if one dares use the term. The tone was clinical, controlled, scientific. They tracked symptoms, measured reactions, compared internal organs of the living with those of the dead. They published findings, shared insights. Some even hoped to use their data post-war to secure positions in academia. What makes these journals so disturbing isn't just the violence. It's the coldness, the effort to make the monstrous feel sterile, controlled, helpful, as if pain could be converted into something productive so long as it had a proper heading and was written in neat columns. The Soviet gulags, too, had their record keepers. Prison wardens and NKVD agents compiled dossiers that ran thousands of pages deep. If a prisoner cried out at night, it was noted. If they died of exposure, logged. If they confessed, true or not, it was filed. Some guards kept informal notes. Some wrote letters home about their work. Ordinary, small, chilling glimpses into a world where death was routine. The poet Osip Mandelstam died in the camps. His name appears, scrawled on a transfer form, one of the most brilliant voices in Russian literature, reduced to a line in a column on a clipboard. When the camps were shut down, many of these records vanished, but others remained, hidden in archives, smuggled into the West, or worst of all, digitized, preserved in modern databases where you can still search them today, as if shopping for groceries. And yet, even these bureaucracies of death don't always contain the whole story. Some killers wrote not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because they believed their work mattered. We end this first part with a man who, like Franz Schmidt, believed himself righteous. But unlike Franz, he was not trained. He was not born into his role. He was at first just a soldier, prison guard, an average man. and his journal is one of the darkest documents in all of World War II. It belongs to Johann Niemann, deputy commander of Sobibor, one of the Nazi extermination camps. For decades, his journal was lost, but in 2020, it resurfaced, pages of text and photographs documenting life inside a death camp. Not the horror from the eyes of the victims, but from the perspective of the man who made it possible. He wrote about new arrivals, about meals, about his dog, about the smooth operation of the gas chambers. Photographs show him laughing with fellow officers, eating cake, petting his pet goose.
No scham, no horror.
Just life as he saw it. A man so accustomed to murder, he thought nothing of photographing his lunch break between executions. These journals, some handwritten, others typed, were not meant for empathy. They were meant for posterity, for evidence, for record, or worse, for pride. But we read them now not to honor their authors. We read them because they exist, because the ink never flinched, because memory, once preserved, can no longer be denied, and because someone has to bear witness not just to the victims, but to the brutal calm of the ones who held the pen. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore how executioner guilds and hereditary killers passed down methods of death as if they were crafts, and kept the instruction manuals. Until then, let your thoughts settle. Let the dark corners of history flicker in and out like candlelight. And remember, not all those who wrote meant to be remembered. Let us continue. Part 2, The Profession of Death. They didn't always call themselves killers. They called themselves meisters, maîtres de hautes œuvres, or simply men of the craft. In medieval and early modern Europe, execution was not just a punishment, it was a profession. And like any craft passed from father to son, it came with tools, traditions, and instruction manuals. The only difference, these tools weren't for building, but for ending. Executioners were trained, tested, and most disturbingly documented. In the Holy Roman Empire, executioners formed guilds. Not formal unions, but loose hereditary networks. The job was often inherited. A son born into the blood would rarely escape it. In some regions, there were schools of technique, especially for sword beheading, which was considered an art form among the upper classes. A poorly done stroke brought shame not only to the executioner, but to the city. Precision mattered, and so they took notes. These weren't diaries in the traditional sense. They were instructional codices, manuals written in margin-heavy German script, passed quietly through generations of state-sanctioned killers. Some were bound like medical texts. Others were collections of loose-leaf drawings, diagrams, and macabre shorthand. How to tie the noose to break the neck, not strangle. Where to strike with the sword for a clean sever. How to deliver mercy to the deserving and humiliation to the damned. One such document, found in the archives of Würzburg, outlines over 40 methods of execution. Drowning, burning, quartering, each with its own procedural steps and cultural rules. Not because the executioner had a choice, but because society demanded spectacle as well as order. Take the wheel, a horrifying method in which a criminal was tied across a cartwheel, then beaten limb by limb until their bones broke into mush. The manuals describe how to start with the shins, then the thighs, then the arms, and finally the chest. Only after each break could the final mercy blow be delivered. One mistake in the sequence could render the whole performance improper. Some instructions even suggest what prayers to say between blows. This was not hidden knowledge. These manuals were sometimes read aloud in court before sentencing, so all present knew the law was being followed precisely. The purpose was never mercy. It was ritual, consistency, documentation of horror so rehearsed, it became liturgy. In France, the office of the royal executioner belonged for 6 generations to the Sanson family. Charles-Henri Sanson, the most famous of them all, oversaw nearly 3,000 executions during the French Revolution, including that of King Louis XVI, and he too kept records. Sanson's journals are unsettling in their formality. The dates are precise. The numbers are accurate. His entry for the king's beheading simply notes: January 21st, 1793, Louis Capet, executed by guillotine, 10:22 a.m. A king reduced to a timestamp. Sanson wrote of the crowd, of the reaction, of the trembling hands of the former monarch. He noted the angle of the guillotine's fall and the condition of the blade, and then, without commentary, moved on to the next. Later, after the revolution had turned on itself, Sanson was ordered to execute many of the same radicals who had once applauded him. Danton, Robespierre, Desmoulins, their names, too, appear in his log.
No judgment, no flourished.
Just ink. The blade does not discriminate, neither does the pen. Not all killers wrote for the public eye. Some kept personal ledgers. One such executioner in early modern England kept a list titled, "The Departed of My Hands." It was never meant for court. It was never meant for the crown. He wrote only for himself. In looping script, he listed the condemned not by name but by category. Witch, heretic, sodomite, coward. No page numbers.
No dates.
Just a grim catalog of the damned, as he saw them, like a collector listing specimens. In Poland, the family of Stefan Chinaki, an 18th century hangman, kept his execution ropes as heirlooms. Each was labeled with the date and the crime. The family crest bore a gallows. It was to them an honor. Their trade was vital, their tools sacred, and in a small notebook they wrote which noose had been used for which criminal. These were not rogues. These were professionals. Their journals, their notes, their rituals, all part of a long-standing system that fused state violence with personal identity. As the centuries turned, the methods modernized, but the instinct to record remained. In 19th century America, executioners rarely kept personal diaries, but state-appointed hangmen often filled out official post-execution reports. Some, like George Mailden, the so-called Prince of Hangmen, in the U.S. federal court system, compiled detailed descriptions of each hanging. Not just the crime, but the posture of the condemned, the time it took to die, whether the neck broke or if strangulation occurred. These were not medical reports. They were reputational tools. A clean kill meant a competent hangman. A botched one meant disgrace. In his memoir, Mailden reflected on his work with no trace of regret. He described the precision needed to measure the rope, the importance of a well-oiled trapdoor, the subtle weight adjustments for different body types. He wasn't being gruesome, he was being proud. In one passage, he writes, "A man of 170 pounds requires a fall of 6 feet 8 inches for proper cervical dislocation. Shorter or heavier, the rope must be adjusted. It is not cruelty, it is craft."
Craft.
That word again. Execution, he believed, was not brutality, it was calculation. and calculation deserved record-keeping. But what happens when the record becomes the purpose? In Stalinist Russia, the NKVD agent Vasily Blokhin personally executed thousands of prisoners during the Great Purge. Night after night, he worked in a soundproofed room at the Lubyanka prison, donning a butcher's apron and leather gloves. His weapon of choice was a German Walther pistol, efficient, quiet, reliable. Blokhin is estimated to have killed over 7,000 Polish prisoners in a single month during the Katyn massacre. And while he did not keep a personal journal, his superiors did. His tally sheets, his performance reviews, the number of bullets used, the speed of his work. These weren't notes to remember, they were notes to measure, like logging bushels of wheat or feet of railway track. Death as data. The Soviets rewarded him with medals, promotions, silence, and behind closed doors, his work was preserved on file cards and internal reports.
No emotion.
Just metrics. If Franz Schmidt was the medieval craftsman of death, Blokhin was the assembly line. Sometimes the only reason these documents exist today is because someone couldn't help but write them down. Because the urge to document, to explain oneself, was stronger than the urge to disappear. In 1945, as the Reich crumbled, SS officer Kurt Gerstein wrote a 30-page confession, a chilling, meticulous account of his time inspecting extermination camps. He described watching gas chambers in operation, the screaming, the piles of bodies, the surreal calm of the commandants. He claimed he had tried to sabotage the effort from within, though no one is certain of his motives. What's clear is that he had to write it down, perhaps for justice, perhaps for absolution, perhaps simply because the memory would have otherwise rotted him from the inside. He wrote, "I saw everything, and I could not forget. I wish to speak so that those who come after me know that there was a man who did not stay silent." But even that confession, raw and desperate, is filled with dates, figures, witness names. It is as much a report as it is a reckoning. We write things down to remember, but what if they should not be remembered? What if some memories, precise, perfect, inked in the hand of the killer, serve not as warnings, but as testaments? The journals, the logs, the ledgers, they don't judge. They don't scream. They don't whisper the pain of the victims. They simply persist. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part. Because some memories, once written, refuse to die. Part 3, The Torturer's Notebook. What does it take to spend your life listening to screams and still bring a pen? The torturer is not like the executioner. The executioner ends things, but the torturer lingers. His job is to stretch time, to measure pain, to operate just below the threshold of death. And unlike the battlefield or the gallows, torture is rarely public. It happens behind doors, in basements, under orders. So when a torturer writes, he does not write to be seen. He writes to control, to perfect, to make something unspeakable legible. And in some of the most chilling archives on Earth, these notebooks still exist. One such record comes from the Tower of London, 1581. The prisoner was Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest accused of treason. The torturer, whose name we no longer know, kept a log, not for the public, but for the crown. A quiet document, no title, just dates and effects. November 5th, applied rack for 1 hour, dislocation of shoulder noted, refused confession. November 7th, second rack, complains of weakness in limbs, Hands immobile. Interrogation follows. Each entry is brief, calm, almost medical. Campion was eventually executed, but his torturer's notes remain, tucked between royal warrants and court records, as if part of routine administration, which in truth they were, the torment of the body made bureaucratic. Torture logs were not unique to England. Across the Spanish Inquisition, scribes recorded confessions extracted through ordeal, not just for legal purposes, but as spiritual proof. Pain they believed purified, and if you screamed the truth at the height of agony, it must be real. One infamous document, housed in the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, outlines the multi-day torture of a woman accused of heresy. The entries describe each phase in detail. Day 1, strappado, dislocated shoulders.
No confession.
Day 2. Each event is time-stamped, witnessed, initialed, and bound with a seal. There is no mention of screaming, no note of blood, just effects, results, and a tidy ending. It reads like a performance review. But the most disturbing records come not from courts or kings, but from men who tortured because they wanted to, and then wrote about it proudly. In Nazi Germany, SS Dr. Sigmund Rascher conducted freezing experiments on prisoners at Dachau. Victims were plunged into ice tanks to test survival times for downed Luftwaffe pilots. Rascher kept immaculate notes. Subject 3, 28-year-old male. Time to unconsciousness, 53 minutes. Revived via heat lamp. Convulsions noted. No verbal coherence post-revival. Subject 4, female. Died after 47 minutes. Blood sample taken post-mortem. Each test included a graph, skin temperature, heart rate, notes on behavior. He signed each page like a scientist. These were not secret notes. He presented them to Himmler, suggested new methods, asked for more subjects. Some of his experiments were published in internal medical bulletins, data carved from flesh intended for use. What's worse, after the war, some Allied researchers reviewed Rascher's findings. They debated whether the data, obtained through torture, could be useful. It wasn't just the killers who kept the record alive. Sometimes it was those who read it. In Chile, during the Pinochet regime, Dina, his secret police ran torture centers disguised as safe houses. One such place was Villa Grimaldi. Survivors tell of electrocution, beatings, waterboarding, but Dina agents also kept logs. One recovered document lists prisoners by number. For each, methods used, resistance level, and psychological stability. Some victims were given ratings, a 3 for mild, a 5 for extreme resistance. Names were rarely written, just codes. But a separate private notebook, found in an abandoned office, revealed more. The torturer had written observations in the margins. No fear, still arrogant. These weren't official notes. They were personal, scrawled in looping cursive like a teenager's diary, a log of cruelty that, for him, seemed to be an act of pride or artistry. That notebook is now held in a Chilean museum. The author was never identified. And then there's the United States. In the aftermath of 9/11, the CIA authorized what it called enhanced interrogation, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, cold cells, stress positions. And every single act was documented. Contract psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen devised many of the techniques. They also helped build the documentation systems. Torture, they believed, needed protocols, and the CIA's black sites around the world became testing grounds, places where people vanished and paperwork flourished. Thousands of pages of internal memos, logs, and cables have since been declassified. One entry describes a prisoner strapped to a gurney, water poured over his face again and again. The log reads, Session 17, subject appears resistant, shows signs of physical wear, no actionable intel obtained, recommend continued application. Session 27, vomiting, a hemorrhage, cessation at 1:48, subject monitored for vitals, restraints remain in place. There is no emotion in these lines, only procedure, clinical void. Some agents kept informal notes too, margins filled with things like uncooperative, faker, might be holding back. These were sometimes scribbled beside drawings of equipment or hand-tallied marks of each session. In 2014, the U.S. Senate released a report concluding that the interrogations were not only brutal, but largely ineffective. But the logs remain, buried in classified archives, filed in the same language as a maintenance report. We know what happened not because victims survived, but because someone wrote it down. But not all torturers were cold. Some were disturbingly poetic. In 1930s Stalinist Russia, secret police officer Boris Rodos wrote letters about his interrogations. Not official logs, letters. He described how he broke people, how he paced the questions, when to offer water, when to smile. He even described the moment a prisoner's mind gave up. There is a crack, a certain shift behind the eyes. It is like watching glass fracture before it breaks. This wasn't a confession. It was pride. He saw himself as a sculptor. He bragged to friends in the NKVD about how quickly he could extract names. His letters were never meant to be published, but some survived, archived by accident, hidden in old files, or copied by comrades who later feared becoming his victims. The line between torturer and memoirist blurred. And perhaps that's the lesson here. The killers who wrote, be they executioners, interrogators, or medics, weren't always hiding. Often, they believed they were professionals, scientists, servants of order, or worse, artists. And their journals, notes, and logs weren't confessions. They were trophies. Some were intended for courts, some for comrades, some for no one at all. But they remain. Paper doesn't flinch. Ink doesn't blush. Only we, the readers, do. In Part 4, we'll look at the ways these killers tried to preserve themselves through memoirs, autobiographies, and post-war justifications. Not private notes, but public legacies. How some of the worst crimes in history were retold by the very hands that committed them. The pen, they say, is mightier than the sword. But what happens when it's held by the same hand? Let us continue. Part 4, Memoirs Without Mercy. Most people write their memoirs to be remembered. But what if you were remembered for the worst thing you ever did and wanted to be? This is where the journal becomes something else. No longer a ledger or a log, but a legacy, a memoir, a last attempt to control the story before it gets told by someone else. And across history, the men who inflicted the most suffering have often been the ones most eager to write it all down, not in shame but in defense, or worse, in pride. These were not the quiet notebooks of executioners or the cold forms of bureaucrats. These were books, autobiographies, published works, stories designed to be read, and they tell us not only what happened, but how the killers wanted it to be understood. Let's begin with one of the most infamous voices of the 20th century, Rudolf Höss, Commandant of Auschwitz. In 1946, as he awaited execution, Haas sat in a Polish prison and wrote a full account of his life. It became known as the Auschwitz Memoirs. Handwritten, nearly 300 pages. Not under duress, but by request, by Allied authorities who wanted a detailed record of the final solution. And Haas delivered. He wrote about the gas chambers, about Zyklon B, about how he streamlined the killing process to increase capacity. He included numbers, how many people could be killed per day, how long the crematoria burned. He even described building a house for his family next to the camp. He wrote with detachment, but also, at times, with something that felt like pride. He claimed he was not a sadist, that he was simply following orders, that he was efficient, that he improved the system. He did not dwell on the screams. He dwelled on logistics. One passage stands out. We had achieved a throughput of 10,000 per day. The limiting factor was not the chambers, but the cremation rate. Throughput, a term from factory work, as if human lives were product. Bottlenecks, margins. He included no photos, no drawings, just the cool, procedural language of someone who viewed death as a puzzle to solve. The memoir ends with a short note to his wife and children. "You must not be ashamed of me, but we are." He was not alone. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most prolific hangman, also wrote a memoir, Executioner, Pierrepoint. In it, he describes the 400-plus people he executed, including war criminals at Nuremberg, IRA members, and ordinary British citizens. His tone is different from Haas, more somber, reflective, but still disturbingly calm. He discusses rope lengths, last words, and the feel of a proper drop. He says he developed an instinct for weight, for the moment the floor would fall and the body would stop. He writes, "When I pulled the lever, I always felt it was not I who killed them, but the law." He believed in justice. That's what makes it haunting. He believed he was helping society, making things clean, final. But as the memoir progresses, doubt begins to creep in. He questions whether capital punishment truly deters. He admits some of the condemned were likely innocent, and he reveals the strain it placed on him, how the work followed him in his dreams. And yet he kept the records, the notes, the exact weights, the measurements. Even in retirement, he could recite rope lengths by heart. Then there are those who didn't wait to be asked. Adolf Eichmann, after his capture in Argentina and before his trial in Israel, began writing his own defense, a 1,300-page manuscript called Götzen, or False Gods. It was part memoir, part political treatise, part confession, part denial. He attempted to justify his role in organizing the transport of millions to death camps, claimed he had no hatred for Jews, claimed he was merely a cog. But then he would contradict himself. In one passage, he refers to himself as the architect of the logistics. In another, he muses on the beauty of order in train schedules. In another, he compares himself to Martin Luther, suggesting history would one day vindicate him. Eichmann wrote not to reflect. He wrote to win. The manuscript was never published in his lifetime, but it survives. Pages of dense, angry handwriting, as though he still believed that, if he could just explain it right, someone would understand. That someone would admire the system. Even lower-ranking killers sometimes tried to leave their version of events. Paul Blobel, commander of Einsatzgruppe C and one of the key figures behind the Babi-Yar massacre, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered in a ravine over 2 days, also wrote a short confession before his execution at Nuremberg. But his tone is bitter, defiant. He claims he was just doing his duty, that others did worse, that the Allies were hypocrites. And yet, in his handwriting, a strange neatness, precise German script, no crossouts.
No emotion.
He was writing not for history, but for posterity, for his name. Even as the noose waited. In Japan, Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa, responsible for the Bataan Death March, wrote a prison memoir called The Private Diary of General Homa. In it, he discusses the events of the war, but denies direct responsibility for the atrocities. His writing is more literary, reflective. He quotes poetry, laments the fall of the empire. But he also glosses over the 70-mile forced march that left thousands dead. He blames subordinates, miscommunication, the fog of war. What he never does is take ownership. He was executed in 1946, but his words live on, translated, published, read. Then there's the strange case of Erich Priebke, an SS officer involved in the Ardeatine massacre in Italy, where 335 civilians were killed in retaliation for a partisan attack. Decades after the war, he was tracked down by journalists, and rather than hide, he sat for interviews, wrote essays, claimed the killings were lawful, claimed the victims were communists, claimed he slept well at night. He died under house arrest in 2013 at age 100. He had over 60 years to rewrite his story, and he spent many of them trying. He never apologized. Why do they write? Maybe they believe the page will save them, that words will soften judgment, that a tidy narrative can erase a lifetime of screams. Or maybe it's simpler. Maybe the act of writing feels like control, one last assertion of power over the truth, over the reader, over the memory. Because if you tell the story first, you shape how it's remembered. But here, in this quiet space, we remember differently. We read not to forgive, not to understand, but to bear witness. To see how far the human mind can bend to justify the unjustifiable, and still reach for a pen. Part 5, the archives that refuse to burn. Some memories survive in hearts, others in headlines. But the darkest memories, those that history tries to forget, often end up buried in archives, temperature-controlled rooms, steel cabinets, dustless shelves lined with horrors. And the strangest truth? Many of the world's most chilling records, the journals of executioners, torturers, war criminals, were never destroyed. They were filed. Governments kept them. Museums cataloged them. Secret police buried them. And every now and then, someone opens a drawer and finds a piece of the past that was never supposed to breathe again. This is the strange afterlife of the killer's pen. Not in the mind, not in folklore, but in folders and ledgers. In box 47C, in drawer 9, in cold ink that still hasn't dried. In the basement of the International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen, Germany, there are over 30 million documents, transport lists, camp rosters, arrest records, many handwritten by the perpetrators themselves, clerks of death, secretaries of genocide. These records were kept not for future reflection, but for wartime efficiency. Trains needed to run, names needed to match bodies, work assignments needed to align with quotas. Today, these records are used to trace lost relatives, to locate names once thought erased. But in every page, there is another truth. The killers didn't hide what they did. They kept it organized. In one logbook, prisoners at Dachau are listed by category: political, Jew, a social, Jehovah's Witness, gypsy, a color-coded system for murder. Another contains lists of property confiscated from new arrivals: rings, dentures, shoes, columns for each item, initials of the clerk. Nothing emotional, just inventory. These are the ledgers of evil, not screams, but silence, not blood, but bureaucracy. In Romania, the Securitate Archives, once the feared nerve center of Nicolae Ceausescu's secret police, have become a public research facility. Wall after wall of surveillance reports, interrogation transcripts, and handwritten confessions fill its shelves. Some are banal, others unbearable. A recently declassified folder contained hundreds of pages from a single prison, each page a near-identical form. Subject: resisted. Method: isolation. Outcome: compliant. But in the margins, handwriting. Human again. Personal. Uncooperative. Needs longer. Suggests sleep deprivation. These weren't forms for justice. They were weapons made of paper. Scholars now call this the architecture of terror, a system where documentation didn't protect you, proved your guilt. In Cambodia, after the fall of the Khmer Rouge, the Tuol Sleng prison, known as S21, was found abandoned. Inside were thousands of photographs and written confessions, all meticulously cataloged by the regime. The confessions were almost always forced, tortured out with electric shocks, beatings, or threats to family. But they were written neatly, carefully, with names, dates, signatures. Some were signed in blood. Even the photographs taken just before execution were labeled, cross-referenced. Some were paper-clipped to the written testimonies. Others were pinned to corkboards. Today, these rooms are a museum. The binders are open. You can walk past the shelves, see the names, the faces. But the paper is fading. The ink is going. What remains is the knowledge. Even genocide had a filing system. In Argentina, the dictatorship of 1976 to 1983 left behind something eerie: scrapbooks. Military officers tasked with the abduction and torture of subversives often made personal records, not official logs, photo albums. Some included Polaroids of detainees. Others had clippings of news articles marked with underlined names. One recovered book contained birthday cards made by the children of the disappeared, stolen by officers and pasted into the margins as trophies. Why keep these? Why preserve evidence of crimes? Because the killers didn't always think they were doing something wrong. In fact, some believed they were preserving history, their version of it. When democracy returned, families searched the homes of ex-officers and found boxes hidden in closets. Some of the notebooks are now part of truth commissions. Others have vanished again. Even in modern Russia, the archives of the Soviet secret police, Cheka, NKVD, KGB, have been partially opened, partially resealed, and remain deeply contested. In the early 1990s, after the fall of the USSR, scholars rushed into the vaults. What they found were millions of records, execution lists, personal memos, interrogation diaries. One of the most haunting, the Stalin Execution Ledger, a book of approvals, Stalin's own handwriting scrawled next to names. Shoot, sometimes with exclamation points, sometimes underlined. Many of the executioners who carried out these orders kept their own logs, marked only by prisoner numbers and sentences. But these became part of the archive too, bound together, crime and command side by side. Since then, access has been restricted. Some documents have disappeared, others quietly leaked. But even hidden, the knowledge is there. Every bullet was logged. And then there are the archives that don't survive because someone made sure they wouldn't. In Iraq, as Saddam Hussein's regime collapsed, the Ba'athist secret police tried to burn their files. Offices set ablaze, paper torched in piles, but not everything burned. Human Rights Watch recovered thousands of scorched documents, some half-legible, some waterlogged. And even in that state, they told stories, arrest orders, interrogation transcripts, lists of dissidents. Some were found in folders labeled confidential, administrative. Inside, handwritten notes, applied stress method, subject refused to speak. Paper doesn't scream, but it doesn't lie either. In Guatemala, where the army waged a decades-long campaign against its own indigenous citizens, a forgotten warehouse was discovered in 2005. Inside, tens of millions of documents, police rosters, surveillance logs, torture orders, dossiers on children, all filed, all preserved accidentally because no one thought to destroy them. Some of the files include marginalia, doodles, coffee stains, jokes written by guards, death turned into paperwork, murder filed under M. When forensic analysts began sorting through the archives, they realized the killers had been astonishingly organized. They kept track not just of targets, but of metrics. How many arrests per day? How many survived? How many didn't? One page reads, outcome: 9 detained, 3 dead, 1 released, situation stable. That page is now on display in a museum of memory. Why keep these things? Sometimes it's fear. Bureaucracies document everything, even when it kills. Sometimes it's pride. A killer who writes often believes his actions are justified, and that the record proves it. Sometimes it's simply habit. State violence runs on forms, orders, reports. It becomes routine, and routine gets written down. But once a record exists, it lives, even if buried, even if hidden in a vault beneath dust and shame. The memory doesn't fade, it just waits. In part 6, we'll enter the modern digital age, where these killer records are no longer just stored on paper, but scanned, uploaded, searched. We'll explore how war criminals from the past are being tracked in the present through the very notes they once penned in arrogance, and how the internet is becoming the final archive of atrocity. Because in the age of data, no page ever truly dies. Let us continue. Part 6, when the archive goes online. A single page, once hidden in a locked cabinet, can now be seen by millions. A scribbled signature, once buried in a courthouse basement, can be magnified, downloaded, and used in courtrooms half a world away. We have entered the digital era not just of history, but of accountability. And the killers who wrote their thoughts in pride or habit never imagined their words would live forever, one keystroke away. Because now, their journals aren't just preserved, they're searchable. And what once whispered in vellum now shouts from the cloud. In the Netherlands, the digitization of Holocaust-era transport lists from Westerbork, the Nazi transit camp, has made it possible for families, historians, and prosecutors to track the exact dates and destinations of deportees. These records, often filled out by Dutch clerks, include full names, birthdays, train numbers. They were meant to manage a system, but today they reveal it. A man researching his grandmother found her listed by maiden name. Train 14. Destination, Auschwitz. A tiny scrawl in the remarks column reads, "Elderly, not fit for work." A death sentence rendered in shorthand. What makes it worse? The handwriting is tidy, practiced. The person who wrote it probably filled dozens of forms that day. But now, thanks to digital access, that page, once hidden, is visible to anyone with an internet connection. And the memory lives on. The Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., has scanned tens of thousands of Nazi documents. Ghetto ledgers, confiscation records, SS rosters. Many are handwritten. Many bear signatures of men who never faced trial. Now, through AI-enhanced handwriting recognition, researchers are identifying names across multiple documents, connecting a soldier's name on a deportation order in 1941 with his presence at a death camp 2 years later. Pieces of paper, scattered across archives, are now stitched together, and sometimes those threads lead to living men. In 2021, a 100-year-old former camp guard was convicted in Germany after his name appeared on typed rosters and guard schedules, unearthed and cross-verified through digitized archives. His past had been paper. Now it was pixels, and pixels don't forgive. The Stasi Records Agency in Germany houses 111 kilometers of surveillance files, everything from blackmail notes to secret photographs. When East Germany collapsed, the agency tried to shred its documents. Citizens stormed the buildings to stop them. Now, those torn pages are being digitally reconstructed piece by jagged piece. Specialized scanners match edges, fonts, ink density. It's slow, meticulous. But every day, a few more fragments return to legibility. And in those fragments, the notes of interrogators, the names of informants, the whispered betrayals that once lived in fear and now live in light. Some of those informants fled when the wall fell, but the records are catching up. In Yugoslavia, during the Bosnian War, war criminals left behind documents of chilling clarity. Prisoner rosters, mass grave coordinates, orders typed, signed, faxed. Today, much of that material is stored in The Hague, in the database of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY. What was once kept in military barracks or burned in office fires now survives on servers. Backed up, cross-referenced, impossible to erase. In one infamous example, a commander who denied issuing execution orders was confronted with a scanned copy of his own faxed memo. His signature, the order, the result, conviction. The killer had written his own future on a piece of paper he never thought would travel so far. The Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, investigating atrocities from the Shining Path conflict, digitized tens of thousands of testimonies and military records. Some came from victims. Others came from soldiers and commanders who left behind logs and orders. One scanned field report, once buried in a military warehouse, described a cleansing operation in a village. Casualties, unknown, but a villager, decades later, recognized the phrasing in the digital archive. Her father's name had never appeared before. Now it does. Sometimes memory requires a machine to see what the eyes once missed. Even ISIS, in its short and brutal reign, kept records, ledgers of weapons, tax receipts from occupied towns, birth certificates issued under the Caliphate seal. When towns were liberated, journalists and intelligence officers recovered troves of paper. Later, many were uploaded, scanned into open databases for analysis. In one file, a list of local residents marked with an X beside their names. Those who had resisted, those who would be executed. The men who wrote these lists didn't expect them to survive. But printers jam, photocopiers malfunction, some papers were left behind. Now, years later, those sheets, creased, bloodstained, scanned, have become evidence. The killer may die, the file may not. But this digitization raises a disturbing question. What happens when anyone can read these things? When a sadist's personal diary, once scrawled in secret, is now uploaded and browsed like a museum exhibit, do we risk giving voice to the wrong people? Many institutions wrestle with this. Some redact names, others restrict access. A few digitize only fragments. But the truth remains. In a world that remembers everything, the killers who wrote things down are often remembered more clearly than those who screamed. The torturer's signature survives. The executioner's rope measurements live in spreadsheets. The interrogator's margin notes become metadata. And in that strange reversal, the perpetrators are often better documented than their victims. This is the final betrayal of ink. It outlives the body. It outlives the war. It outlives denial. Even when the killers want to forget, the archive remembers. And in the age of digital immortality, forgetting is no longer an option. In our final part, we'll step away from the documents and turn inward,